The scientific uncertainty excuse. In this video, I'm going to talk about the use of scientific uncertainty as an excuse for dismal performance by generally established scientists, senior scientists, big science programs, government science programs. What do I mean by the scientific uncertainty excuse? This is a situation where scientists make extremely confident statements. These can be about the schedule of a project. They can, in the case of the coronavirus, recently statements that masks don't work, followed by statements that where masks do work and everyone should wear them. They can be statements that for sure there is no person-to-person transmission of the disease. Oh yes, actually there is person-to-person transmission of the disease. Statements that there are no asymptomatic carriers, people who have the disease but show no symptoms, followed by, oh well, yes, sort of, yeah, they do exist. There have been many of these statements during the coronavirus from the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, public health experts like Tony Fauci, and many others. This has become increasingly obvious over the last several months. They are, of course, now making various excuses for this, and I'm going to focus on the scientific uncertainty excuse. In a nutshell, the excuse is, well, science is uncertain, it's tentative, we really don't know everything, new knowledge is coming in, so it's okay that we made these very confident statements that were not qualified with any statements of uncertainty. That's the scientific uncertainty excuse. Science is certainly uncertain. The scientific practice should be to state that uncertainty up front. This is what error bars are for. This is what error estimates, such as statistical error and systematic error. And I'll discuss this further. The scientific uncertainty excuse is not new. It's very common. I encountered it as a graduate student in experimental particle physics, also known as high-energy physics. And even though I knew something about science, I didn't know that much, and I wasn't sure how to respond to it. So I want to explain in detail what the excuse is and why it's wrong, and why people should not let scientists overawe them with these statements, which are often made in a very condescending way. So I worked on a project that was a fiasco. It went way over budget. There were all sorts of mistakes made by senior, experienced people who should have known better. Okay? A simple example is that there was a fiasco with welding aluminum in part of the experiment. Aluminum is used for construction all the time in particle physics experiments. Almost anyone who's familiar with welding, they don't have to be an expert welder, knows that welding aluminum is difficult. It requires special techniques. Somehow these experts, and we're talking about people in their 40s and 50s who've been doing particle physics for years, somehow didn't know this, or they appointed someone in charge of this welding project that didn't know this. That's what they claimed. It was totally inexcusable. It was something they should have known. It cost 6 months and anywhere from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. This is just one example of many of these mistakes that I observed. I say this to demonstrate that top scientists, and these were top scientists, including Nobel laureates and the top peoples in their field, make serious and difficult to explain mistakes. Scientists are human and they screw up, just like all of us, just like ordinary people, just like your car mechanic screws up sometimes. And people dealing with them need to be aware of this and to be skeptical of some of the things they say, as I learned the hard way. So the scientific uncertainty excuse, which I encountered several times during these fiascos, is basically very condescending often the way it's presented. Well, you know, science is really tentative. It's uncertain. We don't know what we're doing. And you should realize that, even though we have been speaking with great confidence up until now, right? And so why did you believe what we told you? Only because we stated it without error bars, without any qualifications, and said it very confidently. Scientists often do this. For example, they often give schedules that don't have error bars. They say, oh, we will do this in 6 months. 5 years later, they're still working on it. The statements are very confident and they're not qualified by any kind of confidence levels. They're stated as if they're confident they can do these things. We've seen many examples of this in the coronavirus crisis. The scientific practice is the notion of significant digits. So if I gave you a schedule scientifically of 18 months, I'm saying maybe it'd be off by one significant digit. By that 8 might be 7 or might be 9, plus or minus 1. If I don't give error bars, then the number of digits of accuracy given, say 18 months, is the error. So if the error was actually 3 or 4, I couldn't even do it with significant differences. I would have to say this could take anywhere from 6 months to 5 years with perhaps a 95% confidence level. This is what scientific practice in principle requires. In public statements to popular audiences, like many of the statements from Tony Fauci or other public health experts, it is common to see them make very confident statements as if something has been very precisely measured or predicted by scientific theories like Maxwell's equations and electromagnetism, which are known to be extremely accurate and don't have these uncertainties that they subsequently turn out to have. When they fall on their face, when they turn out to be wrong from these very confident statements, they will flip and they will start talking about how uncertain science is, how we don't know things, how new information is coming in and we're revising what we know. That's true. That's how science works. But if you make very confident statements, you don't give error bars, or you give tiny error bars and you fail to achieve those error bars, you're not being scientific, and you're engaged in scientific, at best, incompetence, if not misconduct. Now, there are lots of ways that scientists today make these very confident statements to a general audience. They may say the science is settled. There's an overwhelming consensus. There's overwhelming evidence that something is true. Anyone who disagrees is a practicing pseudoscience or a pseudoscientist or a denier, like a Holocaust denier. They're a denier of climate science or a denier of the coronavirus. And you've seen the term coronavirus denier. This is a very powerful emotional appeal because it links the opponents to denying the Holocaust, a terrible atrocity. A scientific issue becomes linked to the Nazis, to mass murder. Very hard to talk about. This is not a scientific practice. Scientific practice is supposed to be objective and unemotional, to keep these kind of emotional arguments out of the argument, to talk about the data, the evidence, the math, those kinds of issues. And we can see very obviously the coronavirus has become very politicized, and we're seeing this, but it's been true even from the beginning. It is appropriate to call scientists out for this flipping from very confident statements, which are not qualified or are implied to be facts, to be so certain that nobody would doubt them, which we have seen repeatedly in the coronavirus and has a long history, and then flipping when it's clear they couldn't have been right. It's clear they're wrong. The project went, factors of 3 over schedule, for example, a very common phenomenon. They don't deliver a vaccine. For example, there is no vaccine for HIV and AIDS, despite enormous efforts. And it's worth noting it's hard to believe that, because the prevailing theory is that an HIV positive person is someone who has antibodies against HIV, but they are still sick and they supposedly will die without treatment. That means that for some reason the antibodies against HIV generated by the natural immune system don't work. So why would you ever think that an artificial vaccine would beat the natural immune system? It's very iffy. Nonetheless, there have been enormous efforts to find an HIV vaccine, which has consistently failed. But scientists have continued to make very confident statements about their ability to do this, and they've been wrong. Not really that surprising. But when you hear this scientific uncertainty argument, and I've seen it as memes, as graphics, as slogans on Facebook, many other sources, don't buy it. It's not true. And understand what the issue is. The scientists have made very definite, unqualified statements that something is true, such as masks don't work, don't wear the masks, they may harm you, they may get you sick. All of this was said. And then they flipped a little while later, and they've now gone bonkers in the other direction for wearing masks. But masks are just one example of many of these instances which have occurred over the last several months. They are making overconfident statements. That's the most generous interpretation. They don't provide error bars. They don't provide confidence levels. They don't qualify what they know and don't know. If science was working properly, then back in February, the statements that you would see from the World Health Organization, from the CDC, from these high public health experts would not be these certain statements. They would be, we don't know. We are in the process of finding out. Or they would be saying, we don't know about this specific disease. Historically, other diseases we've discovered have asymptomatic carriers, for example. It's not unusual. It's present in many, many diseases, probably all, or at least a very large percentage. They would say things like that. They would say, we really don't know with this disease. We haven't confirmed our historical observations. Therefore, caution is advised. But what we've seen with influenza, for example, which should be very heavily studied, it actually doesn't appear to have been that heavily studied in retrospect. But they should be able to cite their experience with influenza, which should be one of the major subjects of study over the last decades due to the Spanish influenza in 1918 being the most feared epidemic in recent history, for this last century. They are claiming a level of certainty, implicitly or explicitly, a level of confidence they clearly don't have, and that is scientific malpractice. It's an error. It should be called out. They should be put on, they should be really questioned. Why were you so certain when you weren't? And now your excuse is, oh, there's new knowledge, things change. No, they should have been saying, we don't know, or we have large error bars on this, or we never measured this for some reason in influenza. We don't really have good data on this. Of course, that's why they do this. One of the reasons they do this is because if they were honest about what they knew and what they didn't know, or what the uncertainties were, they would get hard questions, as they should, about what they've been doing in the past prior to this crisis. Where did all those billions of dollars spent on epidemic preparation, on research, on specifically influenza go, and what have we got for that? They don't want that. So they keep moving from one confident statement that falls apart to another. So in conclusion, the scientific uncertainty excuse is an excuse where situation, a false excuse, a bad excuse, an unacceptable practice, where scientists have made very confident statements, either explicitly claiming a very high level of certainty, that something is close to a fact, they know it, they've done comprehensive research on it, and they know, or have a very high level of confidence in the theory, to the point that it's almost not a theory. Evolution is a fact, for example. They have made these statements, something happens, new information, data appears that contradicts those statements. They then fall back and say, oh, well, science is uncertain, it's a constantly evolving process, it's tentative. Ignore the level of certainty we were claiming before. You don't understand how science works. No, the critics and people who complain about this do, in most cases, although they may not be conscious of it, understand. They're expecting statements that are made confidently, that don't have error bars, that are very, settled science. We know it. Anyone who disagrees with us is a wingnut, is a tinfoil hat theorist, is a denier, is a pseudoscientist. All these kinds of very confident statements. They're expecting those statements to be essentially true, to be very unlikely to be false, and rightly so. Well, when those type of confident statements prove wrong, as they have repeatedly in the current crisis and as they have in the past in other scientific fields, it is appropriate to call it out. It is appropriate to point at it and say, wait a minute, you said this. You said it very confidently. There were no error bars. There was no qualifications that it was uncertain that new knowledge was coming in, or they were, a fine print statement. There is a very, very remote chance we might be wrong, something implying that. I use the language, something is almost certain, to convey that there's always that tiny 1 in a trillion chance I could be wrong, that there's just that life is not certain. Statements like that are very confident statements. And when you say something like, I'm almost certain of this, or there are many ways of expressing almost absolute confidence in what you're saying. Scientists do this, and they've done it incorrectly several times in the coronavirus crisis, and they have done it so in other projects and other research in the past, as I personally experienced as a graduate student. And as I personally experienced, they do this flip where they say, oh, well, science is uncertain, and you shouldn't pay attention to how certain we sounded when we said that. No, if you're sounding really certain, if you're super confident, it's a fact, people that disagree with you are kooks, or any of this kind of language, and there's a range of this overconfident language, you should be called out. It's wrong. It's not the way science should be done. And it's sad that it's very common in big science today that people do this. So don't buy the scientific uncertainty excuse. Hold people who make overconfident statements, scientists especially, who make overconfident statements, to account. They are doing something wrong. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.